So with that, I'd like to welcome Professor Redman onto the show. Professor,
thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. We're honored to have you. And yeah, I don't know how long you were back there, but we just played part of the online class where young, potentially Tree Africa's remains were used as a teaching prop. And so first, I just wanted to ask you your initial reactions when you first heard this story.
Oh, wow. Well, part of the difficulty in studying this history is that you're both continually shocked and appalled at the things you learn. And then unfortunately, I think much of what I'll unfortunately say today is that this fits within a larger pattern of the last century or more of collecting and exhibiting and using these materials as teaching tools and for research, very often without the permission of course, the deceased or their next of kin. So it is something that was shocking and appalling to learn about. The recency of this case. I studied history as an undergraduate. I grew up learning a lot about history, and it wasn't until graduate school when I was TAing for an African-American history course that I learned about the MOVE bombing. So I was shocked, but again, it in some ways fits within these larger patterns of what we know about the practices of collecting and exhibiting human remains for museums, especially.
And Professor, on that point, how widespread is something like this? How many bones, how many sets of human remains are we talking about throughout the U.S. museum system? And from what I understand, smaller institutions, medical practices, private collections?
Yeah, so this was, I think, one of the big things that I was trying to wrap my mind around when I started writing my book, Bone Rooms, was even just to understand. It's a pretty basic question, right? One would think, how many bones are in U.S. museums? And what's sort of shocking is that we don't really have a concrete answer to that question. One answer we do have is geared around a 1990 law that was passed called the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA. And between 1990 and about 1995, give or take a few years, museums were at least compelled to count the number of Native American remains they had and try to at least say on some level who they thought that these remains belonged to. So we know this is a shocking number, but we know there are at least 500,000, 500,000 Native American remains in museums across the United States. Again, what I think Bone Rooms does that this is such a big, vast story that there are a number of people who have written about this, but it was a story that, in my view, wasn't fully told. And one of the stories that not a lot of people, I thought, had really talked about and thought about in much depth were the number of African-American remains that were in museums, going back all the way, dating back to the period of enslavement, where the taking of remains would have been part of a brutal system of chattel slavery, but then also during the Reconstruction era and well into the 20th century, Black remains were exploited. They say to never read the YouTube comments, which is usually a good piece of advice. But you played a piece of, I was recently appeared on Democracy Now! And one of the YouTube comments was, we need to keep our eye on the ball and focus on this MOVE case from 1985. And I understand that thrust and that desire to sort of keep the attention on this recent, really gut-wrenching and heartbreaking case. But I think what I'm supposed to do as a historian is remind people that the reason why these remains ended up there, and often what would happen is after a cold case file was concluded, or maybe a construction site or the Army Corps of Engineers would discover remains, they would end up in museums. And we need to talk and think about the fate of these remains, not just when people discover that they are there because of an online course, but we need to have a more robust national conversation about what even is in museum bone rooms, the place of African American remains in that story, and what should be done with them.
And Professor, so we also know about the Morton Crania collection at UPenn. We know that it features the stolen skulls of hundreds of African Americans, poor and enslaved people. So can you talk a little bit about how this collection sort of exemplifies so-called racial science or scientific racism, a phrase that's used in the title of your book, and eugenics, once purporting to demonstrate the inferiority of Black and brown and Indigenous folks? And what? So can you talk about that and just can you tell us who Samuel Morton is?
Sure. So Samuel George Morton was a collector, sort of a proto-scientist. He's sometimes been called a pseudoscientist because he used a lot of the language and principles and ideas, or at least the veneer of science, to present wrong-headed conclusions about the nature of, simply stated, the size and shape of our skull and the relationship of the size of our skull to things like not just intelligence, but also personality characteristics like ingenuity and creativity and things of that nature. So he's sort of a bridge in some ways between this older form of phrenology, where they really thought the bumps in your skull sort of suggested different things about you. And then later you get, sort of the rise of eugenics. And you have figures sort of bridging that gap, like Samuel George Morton. And what Morton does is he sends out a request for people to send him skulls. He collects some skulls himself, I believe, but he also word gets out, and people start sending him skulls to measure and publish the results in what were sort of rare books at the time, but really influential. And so Morton's work is used by a lot of really racist people, not just in his generation, but in the generation to follow, right around the time of the Civil War, when, of course, a lot of this stuff about the nature of race and what should be done with the freedmen after the Civil War. So Morton's work figured in prominently to a lot of those debates in really unfortunate ways that upheld visions of white supremacy and really racist ideas. So that's where this idea of scientific racism comes in that it upheld these really racialist and racist ideas that connected things like intelligence to race, but it also established this precedent for people to follow up on and not just collect a few hundred or a few thousand skulls, but many thousand skulls to get to that much larger number later on. Let me add one more thing about Morton, though, that's kind of interesting, sure, is that people have then gone back. And one of the things that I'd like to mention that's maybe interesting to your audience that's not talked about very often is that there have been a number of people who have looked at these materials for what we might think of as anti-racist reasons. So people have gone back and looked at some of Morton's original findings and used good science, I would argue, to debunk some of those original findings. So, suggesting, right, that that the theories of race actually, when we study them, they aren't upheld in the universe. But these folks in establishing these bone collections were virtually obsessed with establishing criteria around what race was. So, and there are other examples too. Just really quickly, W. Montague Cobb, who was a physician at Howard University, used his knowledge of these types of collections and x-rays of Jesse Owens' legs after the 1936 Olympics to make arguments that his success, which a lot of people in the 1930s were describing in really racial terms, he instead said, no, Jesse Owens is just a great athlete. There's nothing racially specific about his success. So while these collections have a really troubled and dark history, they're complicated. There are lots of ways to think about them and think about how they've been used.
No, and thank you so much for adding that. We're all about trying to illuminate, the nuanced stories that just don't get attention. And that, we ask everyone who's listening, and watching to check that stuff out. I'd like to go back to what you mentioned, the 1990 Act, and I've read, the preface of Bone Rooms, your book, which we've been, we're going to be sharing the links and your author page, and we recommend everyone reads the professor's books. Incredible detail, horrifying. You sort of paint this portrait of this Lakota warrior, one of hundreds of thousands slain, and they kill this native warrior. They then take the body, they mutilate it, they beat the hell out of it, they scalp it, they break, they celebrate this, then they bury it, only to be dug up about a week or two later, and then it ends up in this medical examiner's briefcase or box, and he decides he's going to conduct experiments on it. He's going to use it for infinity. He's never. This is so. The act that was passed in 1990, in your opinion, does it go far enough, right? And secondly, does something need to be passed that's more specific? Maybe mentioning African Americans, maybe mentioning specifically enslaved people, poor people. In your book, you talk about how they dig up these paupers' graves. Please.
Well, first of all, thanks for asking that question, because sometimes I wonder if I'm not clear enough on this as a sort of argument. I'm deeply in favor of NAGPRA and the folks who are doing really hard work in NAGPRA offices, who are in some ways understaffed and underfunded. A lot of the onus on the repatriation law to try to get ancestors to be returned home is on the tribe to come up with the funding and the legal expertise and get through the bureaucratic paperwork. So in spirit, I do think that there should be a larger law that addresses African American remains and the remains of others who have been exploited in this way. But I think NAGPRA offers this pretty imperfect model, and we maybe need to think bigger and larger and maybe have a more sweeping response to this as a problem. So I've seen some folks who I think are very well-meaning in this debate call for a NAGPRA for Black American remains. And again, in spirit, I support that. But I think we've also learned a tremendous amount in the last 30 to 35 years. And Native tribes in particular have taught us a huge amount about how to work within this law. So just for one quick example of that, there are tribes in Michigan, I think maybe a group of 5 or 6 different upper Midwestern communities that have come up with like a guide, a free PDF handbook of how to work within the law, how to go through these various steps. And now tribal nations from across the country can utilize that. And they say up front in the top of the document, we don't agree on everything. We don't have the same religious and spiritual practices, but we all agree that these ancestors should be brought home and returned to the ground. So on that sort of fundamental starting point, they're able to move forward. So I think if there is a sort of an analogous law that were to be passed, my best advice would be to turn to the African American community leaders, scientists, and scholars who are already well versed with this as a topic for leadership. It should be more broad and sweeping as an issue to deal with this, like you said at the top, with not just big museums like Penn and Harvard, which is what we're talking about now, but also small medical museums, private collections. Do we need to have a larger conversation about this? I think it's time that we do.